There are black families worth billions, even tens of billions. You've heard some of their names. You've seen parts of their success. But what you haven't seen is how they actually operate. Because at this level, wealth isn't just built to be seen, it's structured to stay hidden. Through private empires, layered ownership, and influence that avoids attention, these families exist in plain sight, yet remain out of reach. In this video, we're counting down 10 of the most powerful among them, starting from number 10 to the one family that truly masters staying hidden. 10 to 10. The Tope Awotona Network. The new era of wealth doesn't always arrive with noise. It doesn't announce itself with oil fields, luxury estates, or industrial empires stretching across continents. Sometimes it arrives as something far quieter. Something you use without thinking. Built by Tope Awotona, Calendly looks simple on the surface. A scheduling tool, a digital convenience, a way to book meetings without endless back-and-forth messages. But that simplicity is exactly what makes it powerful. Because underneath that interface is a system embedded into how modern business operates globally. Corporations, startups, freelancers, consultants, millions of interactions every day pass through a platform that most people barely notice, and that is where the illusion begins. There are no physical assets dominating skylines, no oil rigs, no factories, no obvious empire that signals scale in a traditional sense. Yet the valuation tells a different story. Billions. But even that number doesn't fully explain what is actually happening here. Because unlike traditional wealth built on land, resources, or manufacturing, this type of empire doesn't sit in one place. It exists inside behavior itself. Inside how people schedule time, structure communication, and execute decisions. And when wealth becomes embedded into systems people depend on daily, visibility becomes unnecessary. You don't see it, but you interact with it constantly. Every meeting scheduled, every client call is arranged, every workflow is optimized through automation. All of it flows through a system that quietly becomes part of global business infrastructure. And that is the first layer of what this countdown is really about. Because this is not just about rich families, it's about how modern wealth is constructed to blend into normal life, how influence can exist without spectacle, and how entire financial ecosystems can grow without demanding attention. To most people, Calendly is just a tool. But to those who understand how modern power works, it is something much bigger. A structure, a system, a silent layer of control inside global productivity. And that is where this list truly begins. Number 9, the Robert L. Johnson family. Before digital systems quietly reshaped modern wealth, power was already being built through something far more influential than infrastructure. It was being built through culture, and at the center of that shift was Robert L. Johnson, the founder of BET. At first glance, BET looks like a media company, a television network, a platform for entertainment. But in reality, it represented something much deeper. It wasn't just broadcasting content. It was shaping perception. Music, lifestyle, identity, ambition, culture, all flowing through a single controlled channel that reached millions of households. And with that control came something far more valuable than ratings. It created influence over narrative. Because whoever controls what people see controls how they interpret themselves and the world around them. And that is where the first layer of real power began. When BET was eventually sold, most people viewed it as an exit, an industry success story, a financial win, a milestone in Black entrepreneurship. But what follows is where the structure becomes more important than the headline. Because wealth at that level doesn't disappear after a sale. It restructures. The visibility around the company reduced, but the underlying financial positioning didn't. Capital was redirected into private investments, equity holdings, and long-term assets that don't require public attention to function. And that's the part most people miss. They assume that when a company leaves the spotlight, the influence leaves with it. But in reality, influence often becomes more efficient when it stops being visible. Because without public scrutiny, wealth can move differently. It can be redistributed into sectors that don't attract attention. Finance, private equity, ownership stakes, and institutional partnerships. And over time, the Johnson family structure shifted from media visibility into quieter forms of economic participation. Not absent, just less observable. And that creates a very specific illusion. From the outside, it looks like a former empire, but from the inside, it becomes something else entirely. A system that continues to generate value without needing to be seen generating it. And that is where the second entry in this countdown reveals its real purpose. Because this list is not just about who built wealth, it's about how that wealth continues to operate once the spotlight moves away. 8. The Otedola family. At first glance, the Femi Otedola family appears to sit somewhere in the middle of visibility and influence. Unlike completely private dynasties, this is a name that often appears in conversations around wealth, energy, and high-profile business activity. Luxury, public presence, and recognition all form part of the surface narrative. But that surface is only one layer. Because what makes the Otedola structure interesting is not how visible it is, but how strategically that visibility is managed. Behind the public image lies a long history rooted in energy, finance, and high-level investment positioning. The family's wealth has been shaped through movements in the oil sector, financial markets, and carefully timed exits and entries into key industries. And that timing is critical, because at this level of wealth, success is not only about what you own, but when you own it. Assets are not always held permanently. Positions shift, holdings change. Capital is reallocated into different sectors depending on global and regional economic cycles. And most of that movement does not appear in public conversation. So while the name is familiar, the structure underneath is far more complex. The Otedola family represents a form of wealth that is partially visible, but not fully traceable. A lifestyle may be seen, a presence may be recognized, but the internal financial architecture, the exact layering of investments, private holdings, and long-term positioning remains outside public clarity. And this is where the illusion becomes important. Because visibility creates familiarity. And familiarity often creates the assumption of understanding. But in reality, what the public sees is only a controlled portion of a much larger financial system operating beneath it. This is not accidental exposure. It is managed perception. A balance between recognition and privacy that allows influence to remain active without full scrutiny. And that is why the Otedola family sits at this point in the countdown. Not fully hidden, not fully exposed, but operating in the space between both where visibility exists, but understanding is incomplete. And as we move further up this list, that balance begins to disappear completely as wealth becomes more structured, more layered, and far less observable from the outside. Number 7. The Mo Ibrahim family. With Mo Ibrahim, the idea of wealth begins to shift away from visibility entirely. Because this is not a story of constant public presence or lifestyle-driven recognition. It is a story of exit and repositioning. Mo Ibrahim first built his fortune through telecommunications, most notably by developing Celtel into one of Africa's most successful mobile network companies. In a sector that transformed communication across the continent, his influence was foundational. Entire regions gained access to mobile connectivity through infrastructure he helped scale. But what makes this case different is not just what was built, it's what happened after. After selling Celtel for billions, Ibrahim did not continue expanding a public-facing corporate empire in the way many would expect. Instead, his trajectory shifted away from traditional business visibility and into governance, development, and institutional influence. And this is where the structure becomes important, because influence does not disappear when it leaves the market. It relocates. Today, the Ibrahim family's presence is strongest in areas like policy, global development frameworks, and high-level advisory spaces. These are environments that rarely generate headlines, yet carry significant weight in shaping economic and political direction across regions. And that creates a different kind of invisibility. Not the absence of power, but the removal of it from public observation. Unlike industrial empires or consumer-facing brands, this type of influence does not require visibility to remain effective. In fact, visibility can often reduce its efficiency. Because decisions made in these environments are not designed for public consumption. They are designed for outcomes, long-term strategy, and systemic impact. And over time, that creates a structure where influence is distributed rather than displayed. You don't see it in products. You don't see it in branding. You don't even always see it in financial disclosures. But its effects are embedded in systems, institutions, and governance structures that shape entire regions. And that is why this position in the countdown is important. Because the Ibrahim family represents a transition point. From visible wealth to strategic absence to influence that operates entirely within systems most people never directly interact with. And as we move higher in this list, that structure becomes even more pronounced, where wealth is no longer just managed or hidden, but deeply embedded into industries that shape entire economies. Number 6. The Strive Masiyiwa family. With Strive Masiyiwa, the story of wealth shifts into something far more distributed and system-based. Unlike empires built around a single visible product or national dominance, this is a structure that stretches across multiple layers: telecommunications, technology, philanthropy, and global institutional influence. At the center is Econet, a telecommunications empire that helped shape digital connectivity across parts of Africa. Through this foundation, millions of people were connected to mobile networks, financial systems, and digital communication tools that transformed how entire regions operate. But the real depth of this family's influence does not sit in one company alone. It sits in how that influence expands outward. Because over time, Strive Masiyiwa's presence has moved beyond traditional business frameworks and into global advisory roles, institutional partnerships, and strategic development spaces that operate at a higher level than public markets. And this is where visibility begins to break apart. Because unlike industrial wealth that can be tracked through physical assets or consumer brands, this kind of influence is distributed across systems. It does not sit in one location. It does not rely on one company. And it does not depend on constant public exposure. Instead, it exists across multiple interconnected environments: policy discussions, economic development initiatives, and global governance conversations that shape long-term outcomes. And when influence is spread across that many layers, it becomes harder to define from the outside. You might see parts of it: telecom investments, philanthropic work, public engagements, but never the full architecture. Because each layer operates independently, yet contributes to a larger system of power that is not immediately visible. And that is what makes this position in the countdown important. The Masiyiwa family represents a shift from concentrated wealth to distributed influence, where power is no longer measured by what is owned in one place, but by how deeply it is embedded across multiple systems that quietly shape economic and social direction. And as we move higher in this countdown, the structure becomes even more concentrated, where industries are not just influenced, but controlled at foundational levels that most people never fully see. Number 5. The Abdul Samad Rabiu family. With Abdul Samad Rabiu, the story moves from distributed influence into something far more grounded and far more structural. Because unlike wealth that spreads across technology or global advisory systems, this is the kind of power built directly into the physical economy. Through BUA Group, the Rabiu family established a strong presence in cement production, sugar refining, infrastructure development, and industrial manufacturing sectors that quietly form the backbone of national economies. And that is where the first layer of hidden begins. Because industries like these are not built for attention. They are built for necessity. Cement doesn't trend. Sugar doesn't go viral. Infrastructure doesn't create headlines unless something goes wrong. Yet these are the exact systems that determine how cities expand, how construction develops, and how entire regions grow. So while they operate quietly in the background of daily life, their influence is constant. And that creates a different kind of visibility problem. Because when wealth is tied to essential goods, it becomes embedded into systems people use without ever thinking about who controls them. And over time, that creates a perception gap. The public sees finished buildings, functioning markets, and stable supply chains, but rarely connects those outcomes to the families and structures behind them. That is where the Rabiu position becomes important in this countdown. Because unlike wealth that relies on brand recognition or media presence, this is wealth that operates through necessity-based industries. And necessity does not require attention to function. It only requires demand, which means the real power here is not in visibility, but in continuity. These are sectors that operate regardless of economic cycles, cultural trends, or public attention. And within those sectors, control is exercised not through spectacle, but through production capacity, supply chain positioning, and long-term industrial planning. And as the Rabiu family expanded across multiple core sectors, their influence became less about individual recognition and more about structural presence inside the economy itself, which makes them harder to isolate in public perception, but significantly more important in practical impact. Because when a family is positioned at the level of essential infrastructure, their wealth is no longer just financial. It becomes systemic. And as we move higher in this countdown, the pattern becomes even clearer, where control is no longer just about industries, but about entire sectors that power daily life at scale. Number 4. The Motsepe family. With Patrice Motsepe, the idea of wealth begins to move into a different kind of visibility, one that sits between industry control and institutional influence. Built through African rainbow minerals, the Motsepe family's foundation lies in mining, gold, platinum, iron ore, and other critical resources that quietly power global industrial demand. And this is where the first layer of structure becomes important. Because mining wealth does not exist in the same visible space as consumer brands or media-driven empires. It exists underground, and that simple fact already creates a form of natural invisibility. What the public interacts with are finished systems, manufactured goods, infrastructure, technology, transportation. But behind all of that is a chain of extraction, processing, and resource control that most people never directly observe. And the Motsepe family sits inside that first stage of value creation. But their influence does not end there. Because over time, the structure expands beyond mining into finance, investment networks, and institutional positioning, creating a wider presence across South Africa's economic ecosystem. And that is where the second layer of hidden begins. Not in absence of power, but in distribution of it. Because when influence spreads across industries, financial systems, and institutional roles, it becomes harder to define from the outside. You might recognize the name. You might see the wealth ranking. You might even associate it with mining. But what remains less visible is the full architecture. How assets are structured, how influence extends into governance and corporate systems, and how that position is maintained over time. And that is what makes the Motsepe family important in this countdown. Because this is not just industrial wealth, it is structural positioning inside both resource extraction and financial systems that operate at national scale. And unlike empires built on visibility or consumer attention, this kind of wealth does not need public reinforcement to remain effective. It functions through continuity, institutions, and long-term control of value chains that rarely enter mainstream discussion. Which means the real power is not always in what is seen, but in what remains consistently embedded within the system itself. And as we move higher in this countdown, the structure becomes even more concentrated, where wealth is no longer just distributed, but deeply integrated into essential national and global systems. Number 3. The Adenuga family. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly through systems people depend on every day, without ever drawing attention to how deeply it is embedded. With Mike Adenuga, that idea becomes very real. Built through Globacom and significant oil interests through Conoil, the Adenuga family operates at the intersection of two of the most essential industries in any modern economy: communication and energy. And that combination is what makes their structure difficult to fully perceive from the outside. Because telecom is not just a business, it is the infrastructure behind connection. Oil is not just a commodity, it is the foundation behind movement, industry, and national productivity. So when a family is positioned across both systems, their influence is not isolated to one sector. It becomes embedded in daily life itself. And that is where the first layer of invisibility begins, not through secrecy but through integration. These are systems people use constantly without thinking about ownership. Calls are made, data flows, energy moves economies forward. Yet the structures behind these processes remain largely out of public focus. But what makes the Adenuga position even more distinct is the level of personal privacy surrounding it. Public appearances are rare. Media engagement is limited. And even at the highest level of recognition, there is a consistent distance between the family and public narrative, which creates a perception gap. Because while the name is widely known, the full structure behind it is not fully visible. And that is the core of this countdown's theme. Not absence of power, but controlled exposure of it. A system where influence exists continuously, but visibility is intentionally minimized. And over time, that builds something very specific. An empire that operates fully within essential infrastructure while revealing only fragments of its scale to the outside world. Which is why the Adenuga family stands here. Not because they are hidden, but because what is visible is only a fraction of what is actually in motion beneath the surface. 2. The Dangote family. In any conversation about African wealth, one name almost always rises to the surface first: Aliko Dangote. And unlike most entries on this list, this is not a hidden presence in the traditional sense. In fact, it is the opposite. It is one of the most visible private wealth structures on the continent. Through Dangote Group, the Dangote family has built an empire that spans cement production, sugar refining, salt, flour, and one of the most ambitious energy projects in Africa, the Dangote refinery. At scale, this is not just a business empire. It is industrial infrastructure. And that is where the first layer of complexity begins. Because when an empire becomes this large, visibility increases naturally. Factories become landmarks. Projects become national talking points. Expansion becomes public news. The name itself becomes part of economic identity across regions. But here is where the structure becomes more important than the perception, because even within extreme visibility, the full architecture of control is not always fully understood from the outside. Large conglomerates like this are not single-layer entities. They are built through subsidiaries, holding structures, cross-sector investments, and long-term industrial positioning that connects multiple parts of the economy at once. So while the public sees cement plants, refineries, and branded products, what they do not fully see is the internal network of financial structuring, capital allocation, and operational segmentation that allows the entire system to function at continental scale. And that is where the second layer of hidden begins. Not in secrecy, but in scale. Because once a system becomes large enough, it becomes difficult to fully interpret in its entirety from any single perspective. Each sector operates with its own logic, its own structure, and its own internal complexity. And when all of those layers are combined under one family structure, the result is not just a business empire, it is an economic system. But despite this scale, there is still a perception gap. Because visibility creates familiarity. And familiarity often creates the assumption that the full structure is understood. But in reality, what is publicly seen is only the surface layer of a much deeper industrial framework that continues to expand across borders and sectors. And that is why the Dangote family sits here at number 2. Not because they are hidden, but because even extreme visibility does not automatically reveal the full depth of the system behind it. And just ahead is a family where visibility drops completely. Yet influence remains deeply embedded in one of the most powerful industries in the world. Matchup number 1. The Mohammed Indimi family. At the very top of this countdown, the idea of visibility stops being relevant altogether. While names like Dangote dominate headlines, Mohammed Indimi built something very different. Not louder, not bigger in appearance, but far more discreet. Because with Mohammed Indimi, what you are looking at is not a public-facing empire. It is a deeply structured position inside one of the most sensitive and powerful industries in the world, oil and gas. Built through Oriental energy resources, the Indimi family's wealth is tied to exploration, production, and long-term energy assets that operate within Nigeria's core economic backbone. And unlike many of the names on this list, this is not a structure defined by visibility. It is defined by positioning. Because oil wealth does not require public attention to function, it operates through licenses, joint ventures, regulatory frameworks, and long-term production systems that are rarely discussed in detail outside industry circles. And that is where the first layer of hidden becomes complete. Not because the family is unknown, but because the system itself is not designed for constant public visibility. What exists here is a form of wealth that is embedded deep within the energy chain, where value is generated over long periods, often outside the immediate focus of public conversation. And unlike consumer-driven industries, this type of empire does not need branding to sustain relevance. It is tied to global demand, national production capacity, and long-term resource control. But what truly separates the Indimi position from others in this countdown is how quietly that structure operates. There is no constant media cycle, no public display of expansion, no need to maintain attention as a measure of relevance. Instead, influence is maintained through continuity. And over time, that creates a system that is difficult to fully map from the outside, because what is visible is only the operational surface, not the full depth of agreements, partnerships, and resource positioning beneath it. And that is why this family stands at number 1. Not because they are the most talked about, but because their influence is structured in a way that does not require them to be. So while the world focuses on visible billionaires, there is an entirely different layer of wealth operating beneath the surface. Structured, positioned, and deliberately out of reach, because at the highest level, being seen is optional. But control? That's everything. Which of these families' wealth is most hidden to you? Share your thoughts in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Status, like, and share for more hidden power breakdown.